Zixthera stepped off the transport shuttle and looked around Station Apex 7 with excitement and pride. The massive space station stretched out in all directions, its gleaming metal corridors filled with cadets from dozens of different species. She had worked her entire life to earn a place at the Galactic Defense Academy, and now she was finally here among the galaxy's best and brightest minds. Her crystalline blue skin caught the light as she walked through the main corridor, drawing respectful nods from other cadets. The Velthari were known throughout the galaxy for their superior intellect and telepathic abilities. Zixthera had scored highest on every entrance examination, and she expected to continue that pattern here at the academy. She found her assigned dormitory and quickly unpacked her belongings. Her roommate was a quiet Thracian who seemed pleasant enough, though clearly not as academically gifted as herself. After settling in, Zixthera made her way to the first class of the day, Advanced Tactical Theory with Commander Krell Noth. The classroom was large and filled with holographic displays showing various battle scenarios. Zixthera chose a seat near the front, eager to demonstrate her knowledge. As other cadets filed in, she noticed with growing dismay that 5 of her classmates appeared to be human. Humans were a relatively new species in galactic affairs, having only achieved faster-than-light travel a few centuries ago. Zixthera had studied them briefly in her xenobiology classes. They were primitive creatures from a violent world, lacking any significant psychic abilities or advanced evolutionary traits. She could not understand why they had been admitted to such a prestigious institution. Commander Krell Noth entered the room and began the day's lesson. He was an experienced Thracian officer with numerous battle scars marking his thick gray hide. His voice carried the weight of years spent in actual combat rather than theoretical study. Today's exercise will be a hostage rescue simulation in an urban environment. You will be divided into 5 teams, each representing a different tactical approach. The scenario involves 12 hostages held by armed insurgents in a 3-story building with multiple exit points and civilian populations nearby. Zixthera was assigned to a mixed team with 2 other Velthari cadets and a crystalline. From the Andorian system, they immediately began planning their approach using their combined telepathic abilities to coordinate a sophisticated multi-phase assault. Their plan involved careful reconnaissance, precise timing, and the use of advanced non-lethal weapons to minimize casualties. The human team consisted of Jake Morrison, Lisa Chen, Ben Rodriguez, Katie Sullivan, and Danny Walsh. Zixthera watched them with scientific curiosity as they huddled together in what appeared to be casual conversation rather than serious tactical planning. They seemed to be telling jokes and sharing stories rather than analyzing the complex variables of the mission. Jake Morrison appeared to be their leader, a tall man with sun-weathered skin and calm gray eyes. His movements were relaxed and confident, but Zixthera noticed he kept scanning the room and the holographic displays, even while talking with his teammates. Lisa Chen was smaller and moved with quick, precise gestures as she examined the building schematics on her tablet. When the simulation began, Zixthera's team executed their carefully planned approach perfectly. They used stealth technology to avoid detection, employed sonic disruptors to incapacitate guards silently, and coordinated their movements through telepathic communication. Every step followed established military doctrine and demonstrated superior tactical thinking. The human team's approach was completely different and utterly shocking to watch. Jake Morrison led his squad in what could only be described as a controlled assault. Lisa Chen had rigged explosive charges at 3 different entry points, while Katie Sullivan took position on a nearby rooftop with a sniper rifle. When they moved, it was with startling speed and violence. The explosions came simultaneously, creating chaos and confusion among the simulated insurgents. Jake and Ben stormed through the main entrance while Danny and Lisa entered from opposite sides. Their weapons fire was constant and overwhelming, forcing the enemy to take cover rather than threaten the hostages. What disturbed Zixthera most was how the humans seemed to communicate without any visible signals. Jake would gesture briefly with his hand and Lisa would immediately move to cover a different angle. Katie would shift her position on the roof, and Ben would instantly adjust his approach through the building. They moved like parts of a single organism, despite having no telepathic connection. The entire rescue operation was completed in less than half the time taken by any other team. All hostages were secured safely, All insurgents were neutralized and there were no civilian casualties. The human team had achieved a perfect result through what appeared to be nothing more than organized chaos and primitive aggression. During the debriefing session, Commander Krelnoth reviewed each team's performance. When he reached the human team's results, Zixthara could not contain herself. She stood up and addressed the room with the confident tone she used in academic debates. Commander, while the human team achieved the objective, their methods demonstrate a fundamental lack of strategic thinking. They relied on brute force and random violence rather than careful planning and intelligent coordination. This approach might work in simple scenarios, but it represents barely controlled brutality rather than proper military tactics. Jake Morrison looked at her with those calm gray eyes and spoke in a quiet voice that somehow carried clearly through the entire room. Ma'am, with respect, the mission was to rescue the hostages quickly and safely. We did that. The method doesn't matter as long as innocent people go home alive and the bad guys don't. Zixthara felt her crystalline skin flush with indignation. But that attitude ignores the broader principles of warfare and strategic thinking. Your species may have stumbled onto some effective techniques through trial and error, but without understanding the underlying theory, you're just primitive fighters using instinct instead of intelligence. Jake nodded slowly and seemed to consider her words carefully before responding. You might be right about the theory part, but in my experience, when people are shooting at you and innocent lives are at stake, what works is what matters. I'd rather be a primitive fighter who brings everyone home than a brilliant strategist who gets people killed while following perfect doctrine. The other human team members remained quiet, but Zixthara noticed they watched Jake with obvious respect and agreement. Commander Krelnoth called for the next exercise, but Zixthara's mind was already working on the problem of human tactical methods. She would study them carefully and document their deficiencies. Perhaps her analysis could help explain why primitive species sometimes achieved temporary success through luck and aggression rather than proper military science, said. The class ended and cadets filed out to their next sessions. Zixthara gathered her materials and made detailed notes about the day's observations. She was already planning her comprehensive study of human tactical limitations and the dangers of allowing untrained instinct to replace proper strategic education in military operations. Over the following weeks at the academy, Zixthara threw herself into her studies with renewed determination. She dominated every theoretical examination with the kind of performance that made her professors nod with approval. Her enhanced memory allowed her to recall every detail from thousands of historical battles, while her telepathic abilities let her process multiple strategic scenarios simultaneously. In strategic warfare theory, she scored perfect marks on complex examinations covering everything from ancient siege tactics to modern space fleet movements. Professor Velkan, himself a distinguished Velthari general, praised her analysis of the famous Battle of Kepler Station, where superior planning had overcome a 3-to-1 numerical disadvantage. Her xenobiology studies were equally impressive. She could recite the combat capabilities, weaknesses, and behavioral patterns of 47 different species from memory. When asked to develop countermeasures against various alien fighting styles, her solutions were both elegant and devastatingly effective. Advanced weapons theory was perhaps her strongest subject. Zixthara understood the physics behind energy weapons, projectile systems, and exotic matter devices with the kind of depth that impressed even her instructors. She could calculate optimal firing solutions, predict ammunition consumption, and design tactical deployments that maximized firepower while minimizing resource expenditure. Meanwhile, the human cadet struggled with these same academic subjects. Jake Morrison scored adequately on written examinations, but never achieved the kind of excellence that marked true intellectual superiority. Lisa Chen showed some aptitude for engineering concepts, but her theoretical foundations were clearly limited. Ben Rodriguez performed reasonably well in medical and psychological studies, but lacked the comprehensive understanding that came from proper mental discipline. During class discussions, the differences became even more apparent. When Professor Thaldoris posed complex tactical problems, Zixthara would provide detailed analyses that considered dozens of variables and drew upon centuries of military history. Her solutions were mathematically precise and strategically sound. The humans, by contrast, offered simplistic responses that focused on immediate practical concerns rather than broader strategic principles. When asked about the optimal formation for a planetary assault, Jake would describe basic deployment patterns without considering the sophisticated coordination required for multi-vector attacks or the psychological impact of different approach angles on enemy morale. Zixthera began documenting these intellectual deficiencies in a private research project. She noted how human responses lacked the mathematical precision that characterized proper military thinking. Their suggestions often ignored established doctrine in favor of crude improvisations that might work once but could never be systematically applied. During one particularly revealing discussion about siege warfare, Professor Thaldoris presented a scenario involving a fortified position with overlapping defensive systems. Zixthera immediately began calculating firing angles, shield harmonics, and optimal approach vectors using principles she had mastered in her advanced mathematics courses. Her solution involved a carefully choreographed assault using 3 separate attack waves, each time to exploit momentary gaps in the defensive coverage. The plan required precise coordination between ground forces, air support, and orbital bombardment, with contingency protocols for 17 different potential complications. When Jake Morrison was asked for his thoughts on the same scenario, his response was disappointingly simple. I'd look for the back door they probably forgot to cover properly, hit it hard and fast before they could react, then cause enough chaos inside to make the main defenses useless. Zixthera could not hide her incredulous expression. That approach completely ignores the sophisticated defensive systems described in the scenario. A properly designed fortress would never have such an obvious vulnerability, and even if it did, your plan lacks any consideration for backup systems, response protocols, or strategic reserves. Jake shrugged with that maddeningly casual attitude he always displayed. Maybe not, but I've never seen a fortress built by people who didn't make at least one mistake. And if you hit fast enough and create enough confusion, those backup systems and protocols don't matter, because nobody has time to use them properly. This exchange perfectly illustrated the fundamental problem with human thinking. They relied on assumptions about enemy incompetence rather than developing strategies that could succeed against competent opposition. Their entire approach was based on luck and the hope that their enemies would make convenient mistakes. Yet despite these obvious intellectual limitations, the humans continued to excel in practical combat simulations. Every week brought new exercises, and every week the human team achieved results that defied logical explanation. They completed missions faster than teams with superior planning, achieved objectives with fewer resources than mathematical models suggested were necessary, and somehow avoided casualties that should have been inevitable given their crude methods. After one particularly impressive simulation where the humans had rescued a downed pilot from behind enemy lines, Zixthera approached Katie Sullivan to understand their decision-making process. Katie was the team's sniper and reconnaissance specialist, a quiet woman with sharp green eyes that seemed to notice everything. Can you explain how your team coordinates movements without any visible communication system? Zixthera asked. I observed your performance during the extraction mission, and your timing was precise despite the absence of technological or telepathic coordination methods. Katie looked at her with a puzzled expression, as if the question itself was strange. We just know what needs to be done and do it. Jake gives us the general idea, then we figure out the details as we go. When you've worked with the same people long enough, you start to understand how they think and what they're going to do next. But that approach lacks any systematic methodology. How do you ensure optimal resource allocation or minimize risk factors without proper analysis and planning? Zixthera pressed, hoping to understand the underlying logic. Katie shrugged in the same casual way that all the humans seem to use when discussing their methods. I guess it just feels right when we're doing it. We can tell when something's working and when it isn't, so we adjust as we go. Planning is good, but plans never survive contact with the enemy anyway. This response only confirmed Zixthera's growing theory about human limitations. They operated on instinct and emotion rather than rational analysis. Their success was clearly the result of fortunate circumstances and favorable simulation parameters, rather than any genuine tactical ability. She began collecting more detailed data about human performance, noting their reliance on improvisation over preparation, their preference for speed over careful consideration, and their tendency to make decisions based on intuitive feelings rather than logical evaluation of available information. During a study session with her Velthari classmates, Zixthera shared her observations about human tactical methods. Her friends were equally puzzled by the contradiction between human academic performance and simulation results. Perhaps their primitive neural structures allow for faster reflexes, at the cost of analytical capability, suggested Kinthala, a fellow cadet studying xenopsychology. Many species develop enhanced physical responses when they lack more sophisticated mental abilities. That would explain their success in chaotic situations where rapid reactions matter more than careful strategy, agreed Velnara. But it also means they would be completely helpless against an opponent who could force them into a methodical, analytical approach to warfare. Zixthara nodded thoughtfully. She was beginning to develop a comprehensive theory about human combat effectiveness that would explain their temporary successes while predicting their inevitable failures against more sophisticated opponents. Her research project was becoming quite extensive, and she looked forward to presenting her findings to the Academy's Tactical Analysis Board. As weeks turned into months, the pattern continued unchanged. Zixthera dominated academic pursuits while humans excelled in practical applications. She remained convinced that this represented a fundamental limitation in human evolution that would eventually be exposed when they faced truly challenging opponents, rather than the controlled simulations of academy training. The morning began like any other at Station Apex 7. Zixthera was reviewing her notes for advanced fleet tactics when the first alarm sounded. At first, she assumed it was another drill. The Academy conducted regular emergency exercises to keep cadets prepared for various scenarios, but this alarm was different. The tone was harsher, more urgent, and it was accompanied by flashing red lights that bathed the corridors in an ominous glow. Then came the announcement that changed everything. All cadets report to emergency stations immediately. This is not a drill. Korvaxi forces have breached the outer perimeter. Station Apex 7 is under attack. Repeat, this is not a drill. Zixthera felt her crystalline skin go cold with shock. The Korvaxi swarm was legendary for their brutal efficiency and complete disregard for casualties. They were insectoid creatures that fought in massive numbers, overwhelming their enemies through sheer violence and suicidal tactics. No military academy had ever been attacked by the Korvaxi before. She grabbed her emergency kit and rushed toward her assigned station in Section 7. The corridors were filled with cadets moving quickly, but maintaining discipline. Everyone had trained for this possibility, but the reality of actual combat was completely different from simulations. Commander Krelnoth was already at the command post when Zixthera arrived. His usual calm demeanor was replaced by the focused intensity of a veteran warrior preparing for battle. His voice cut through the chaos as he organized the available forces. Listen carefully. The Korvaxi have broken through our outer defensive ring and are advancing through the station in 3 separate waves. We need to establish defensive positions at critical choke points and buy time for reinforcements to arrive. This is real combat, not simulation. Lives depend on your performance. Zixthera found herself assigned to the same defensive unit as the human team, much to her dismay. At a time when careful coordination and strategic thinking would be essential, she was stuck with cadets who relied on primitive instincts rather than proper military doctrine. Jake Morrison was checking his weapon and speaking quietly with his teammates when Zixthera approached. We need to establish a proper defensive plan based on the tactical principles we studied. The Korvaxi will likely advance in standard assault formation, which means we can predict their approach vectors and establish overlapping fields of fire. Jake looked at her with those calm gray eyes. That sounds good. What do you think, Lisa? Can you rig some surprises for them in the main corridor, while Katie finds a good overwatch position? Zixthera was frustrated by his casual response. This required systematic planning, not improvised suggestions. She began outlining a comprehensive defensive strategy based on everything she had learned about urban warfare theory. Her plan involved careful positioning, coordinated firing sequences, and multiple fallback positions. Before she could finish explaining her strategy, the first wave of Korvaxi forces arrived. The sound was unlike anything from the simulations. It was a chittering, screeching noise that seemed to come from every direction at once. The insectoid warriors moved with terrifying speed, their 6 legs carrying them along the walls and ceiling as easily as the floor. Zixthera attempted to implement her defensive plan. But the Korvaxi completely ignored conventional tactical patterns. They didn't advance in predictable formations or follow logical assault routes. Instead, they swarmed through the corridors like a living flood, moving in seemingly random directions and attacking from impossible angles. Her carefully calculated firing positions became useless when Korvaxi warriors began dropping from ventilation shafts directly behind their defensive line. The overlapping fields of fire she had planned were meaningless when enemies could attack from above, below, and through maintenance tunnels that didn't appear on any tactical map. Within minutes, her sophisticated strategy was in complete collapse. The mathematical precision that had served her so well in academic studies meant nothing against an enemy that refused to behave according to established patterns. Panic began to creep into her thoughts as she realized that all her theoretical knowledge was useless in this chaotic reality. The Korvaxi kept coming in endless waves, their high-pitched battle cries echoing through the corridors. They showed no concern for casualties, throwing themselves against defensive positions with suicidal fury. Some carried explosive charges that they detonated without hesitation, caring nothing for their own survival if they could damage the station's defenses. Zixathera watched in growing horror as her section was gradually overwhelmed. Other cadets were falling back in disorder, their own defensive plans crumbling under the relentless assault. The Korvaxi seemed to anticipate every conventional tactic and had countermeasures for every standard defensive formation. The air was filled with the smell of burned metal and the acrid smoke from energy weapons. Emergency lighting cast wild shadows that made it difficult to distinguish friend from enemy. The constant noise of weapons fire, explosions, and Korvaxi battle cries created a sensory chaos that made it almost impossible to think clearly. She tried to use her telepathic abilities to coordinate with other Velthari cadets, but the mental interference from the battle made it difficult to maintain clear communication. The fear and adrenaline flooding through nearby minds created a psychic static that disrupted her normally precise telepathic control. A group of Korvaxi warriors broke through the defensive line and charged directly toward her position. Their compound eyes glittered with alien intelligence, and their razor-sharp claws left deep gouges in the metal flooring. Zixathera raised her weapon and fired, but her shots went wide as terror affected her normally steady aim. This was nothing like the controlled environment of Academy simulations. There were no clear objectives, no predictable enemy behavior, and no time for careful analysis. Everything was happening too fast for rational thought, and her superior intellect seemed completely useless in this environment of pure chaos and violence. The Korvaxi warriors were almost upon her when she heard Jake Morrison's voice cutting through the battle noise. "Lisa, blow the charges now. Katie, clear the balcony level. Ben, get the wounded back to the secondary position. Danny, you're with me." What happened next would haunt Zixathera's dreams for years to come. The humans abandoned all pretense of following conventional tactics and did something that no military textbook had ever described. They improvised a completely new form of warfare in the space of seconds, adapting to conditions that no amount of training could have prepared them for. The sound of Jake's calm voice giving those simple orders would echo in her memory as the moment when everything she thought she understood about combat was proven completely wrong. The humans were about to demonstrate capabilities that no amount of academic study could have predicted or explained. The explosions came first. Lisa Chen had somehow rigged charges throughout the corridor system while the battle was raging, turning the station's own infrastructure into a weapon. The blasts weren't random destruction, but carefully timed to funnel the Korvaxi forces into specific areas where the human team could control the engagement. Zixathera watched in amazement as walls collapsed at exactly the right moments, blocking certain passages while opening others. Emergency bulkheads slammed shut in perfect sequence, dividing the Korvaxi swarm into smaller, more manageable groups. Lisa had turned the entire section into a massive trap, without any blueprint or planning time. Meanwhile, Katie Sullivan had reached an elevated position that gave her clear sight lines down multiple corridors. Her rifle began speaking with deadly precision, each shot perfectly placed to eliminate Korvaxi leaders and disrupt their coordination. She wasn't just shooting randomly, but selecting targets that would cause maximum confusion among the enemy forces. What stunned Zixathera most was how Katie seemed to know exactly where to aim without any visible calculation or targeting assistance. She compensated for distance, movement, and even the strange way Korvaxi warriors moved along walls and ceilings. Every shot found its mark with an accuracy that should have been impossible under such chaotic conditions. Ben Rodriguez had established a field medical station in what appeared to be a completely exposed position, but somehow enemy fire never seemed to reach him. He moved between wounded cadets with calm efficiency, treating injuries and coordinating evacuations while maintaining perfect awareness of the battle flowing around him. Jake Morrison and Danny Walsh moved through the battlefield like they had been fighting together for decades rather than months. They didn't communicate through spoken orders or hand signals, yet their movements were perfectly synchronized. When Jake laid down suppressing fire, Danny was already moving to flank the enemy position. When Danny needed cover, Jake was providing it before he even asked. The most remarkable thing was how the humans adapted to the Korvaxi's unpredictable tactics. Instead of trying to force the enemy into conventional patterns, they embraced the chaos and turned it into an advantage. They moved in ways that seemed random, but somehow always put them in the right position at the right time. When a group of Korvaxi tried to flank through a maintenance tunnel, Jake was already waiting for them. When others attempted to use the ceiling vents, Katie's rifle found them before they could emerge. The humans seemed to anticipate enemy movements through some form of intuition that operated faster than conscious thought. Zixathera found herself caught up in the human team's improvised defense without fully understanding how it worked. Jake gestured for her to move to a specific position, and she discovered it provided perfect cover while offering clear shots at approaching enemies. When she ran low on ammunition, Lisa tossed her a fresh power cell without being asked. The humans fought with a kind of organized chaos that defied every principle she had learned about military coordination. They broke rules constantly, ignored, established doctrine completely, and somehow achieved better results than any textbook strategy could have provided. Their success seemed to violate the basic laws of tactical science. During a brief lull in the fighting, Zixathera watched Jake scan the battlefield with those calm gray eyes. He wasn't analyzing the situation in any systematic way she could recognize, yet he seemed to understand the entire tactical picture with perfect clarity. His next set of orders would redirect the entire defensive effort based on insights that came from nowhere she could identify. Lisa, can you bring down that overhead walkway? Katie, we need you to shift position to cover the new angle. Ben, move the aid station back 50 meters. Danny, you and I are going to clear that side passage before they can regroup. Each instruction was simple and brief, yet the humans responded as if they had received detailed tactical briefings. They understood not just what to do, but why it needed to be done and how their individual actions fit into the larger battle plan. Their coordination was more effective than teams that had trained together for years. Then came the moment that changed everything Zixathera believed about human capabilities. A group of Korvaxi warriors broke through the defensive line and charged directly toward her position. She fired wildly, but her shots went wide as panic overtook her carefully trained responses. The lead warrior was only meters away when Jake Morrison appeared between them. He had abandoned his own defensive position and crossed 20 meters of open ground under heavy fire to reach her. What he did next would be replayed in her memory for the rest of her life. Jake didn't follow any combat technique from the Academy's training programs. Instead, he moved with fluid grace that turned the enemy's attack into their own destruction. He ducked under the first warrior's claws while firing point-blank into its thorax. He rolled to the side as the second warrior's charge carried it past him, then put 3 shots into its back before it could turn around. The third warrior tried to attack from above, dropping from a damaged ceiling panel with its claws extended. Jake spun around and fired without apparent aim, yet his shot caught the creature's center mass and sent it crashing to the floor. The entire engagement lasted less than 10 seconds and left 3 dead Korvaxi warriors at his feet. "Are you hurt?" Jake asked, checking her for injuries with quick efficiency. His voice was completely calm, as if he had just completed a routine training exercise rather than saving her life in desperate combat. Zixathera stared at him in shock. "How did you do that? Those movements, those shots, that timing. Nothing in our training covered techniques like those. How did you know exactly where to be and when to fire?" Jake looked puzzled by her question. "I just reacted to what they were doing. When you've been in enough fights, You start to recognize patterns and respond automatically. You see where they're going to be before they get there, and you put yourself in position to deal with it. But that requires processing dozens of variables simultaneously, while maintaining perfect situational awareness and executing complex motor responses under extreme stress. No training program teaches those capabilities because they should be impossible for most species to achieve. Jake shrugged with that familiar casual gesture. Maybe it's impossible for most species. I wouldn't know about that. But it's not impossible for us. We've been doing this kind of thing for a long time. As the battle continued around them, Zixthera began to see the human team's performance in a completely different light. What she had interpreted as primitive brutality was actually a form of intelligence that operated according to principles she had never encountered in any academic study. The humans weren't ignoring tactical doctrine because they didn't understand it. They were transcending it because they possessed capabilities that made conventional approaches unnecessary. Their coordination wasn't random or instinctive, but rather the product of a kind of intelligence that functioned too quickly for conscious analysis. When the last Korvaxi warrior fell and the immediate threat was over, Zixthera looked around at the battlefield with new understanding. The human team had not just survived the assault, but had turned it into a decisive victory through methods that no military academy taught because no other species could replicate them. For the first time since arriving at the academy, Zixthera realized that there might be forms of intelligence and capability that couldn't be measured by academic performance or theoretical understanding. The humans had just demonstrated something that existed beyond the reach of conventional military science, and she was beginning to understand that her entire perspective on their species had been fundamentally wrong. The rescue ships arrived 6 hours after the last Korvaxi warrior had been eliminated. Station Apex 7 was scarred but intact, its defensive systems having held against an assault that should have overwhelmed any training facility. As medical teams worked to treat the wounded and damage assessment crews surveyed the destruction, Zixthera found herself struggling to process everything she had witnessed. The casualty reports were remarkably light considering the scale of the attack. Most of the serious injuries had occurred in sections where conventional defensive tactics had been attempted. The areas defended by human teams showed minimal losses and maximum enemy casualties. The numbers didn't make sense according to any mathematical model she knew. 3 days later, when the immediate crisis had passed and normal operations were beginning to resume, Zixthera sought out Commander Krelnoth. She found him in his office, reviewing after-action reports and preparing his analysis of the battle for Galactic Defense Command. Commander, I need to understand what I witnessed during the Korvaxi attack. The human cadets demonstrated capabilities that appear to contradict everything I learned about their species. Their performance exceeded what should be possible based on their academic records and theoretical knowledge. Krelnoth looked up from his reports with eyes that held the weight of decades spent in combat. Young Zixthera, I wondered when you would come to me with this question. Please sit down. What you witnessed requires some explanation that goes beyond what we teach in standard courses. The veteran commander activated a privacy shield around his office and settled back in his chair. What you saw was not an accident or fortunate circumstance. Human combat effectiveness is the result of evolutionary adaptations that make them uniquely suited for chaotic warfare. They possess capabilities that no other known species has developed. Humans evolved on a world where violence was constant and unpredictable. Their planet produced predators that hunted in packs, natural disasters that struck without warning, and environmental conditions that changed rapidly and without pattern. To survive, they developed neural systems that can process multiple variables simultaneously while maintaining perfect awareness of their surroundings. But Commander, their academic performance suggests limited intellectual capacity. How can they possess such advanced cognitive abilities while struggling with theoretical concepts that other species master easily? Krelnoth smiled with the patience of a teacher addressing a fundamental misconception. Human intelligence is not inferior, young cadet. It is simply different. Their minds are optimized for real-time problem-solving rather than abstract analysis. They excel at processing immediate threats and opportunities while struggling with purely theoretical exercises. Think of it this way. A Velthari mind is like a powerful computer that can perform complex calculations with perfect accuracy. A human mind is like a sophisticated sensor array that can detect patterns and respond to changes faster than conscious thought. Both are forms of intelligence, but they operate according to completely different principles. The commander pulled up a holographic display showing human military units in action across various battlefields. For the past 2 centuries, since humans joined the galactic community, their military forces have been specifically recruited for situations where conventional doctrine fails. They are deployed against enemies like the Corvaxi, precisely because they can adapt to chaotic conditions that overwhelm other species. Human soldiers serve alongside Velthari strategists, Thoracian heavy infantry, and crystalline technical specialists. Each species contributes their particular strengths to create combined forces that are more effective than any single species could achieve alone. The humans provide the adaptability and tactical intuition that makes rigid plans work in unpredictable circumstances. Zixthera studied the displays with growing understanding. You mean that human combat abilities are not primitive instincts, but rather a form of intelligence that operates too quickly for conscious analysis? Their success comes from evolutionary adaptations rather than intellectual deficiency? Exactly. What you interpreted as intellectual inferiority was actually a completely different form of cognitive processing. Humans think with their entire nervous system, not just their conscious minds. They integrate sensory input, emotional responses, and muscle memory into a unified, decision-making process that operates faster than deliberate thought. The conversation with Commander Krelnoth lasted for hours as Zixthera struggled to rebuild her understanding of human capabilities. Everything she had observed during the Corvaxi attack began to make sense when viewed through this new perspective. The humans hadn't been ignoring military doctrine, but transcending it through abilities that no textbook could teach. 2 days later, Zixthera approached Jake Morrison as he was cleaning his equipment in the armory. She had spent considerable time thinking about how to phrase her apology and request, but when the moment came, she found herself speaking more simply than she had planned. Jake, I owe you an apology. I made assumptions about your capabilities based on academic performance rather than actual ability. I was wrong about your species and wrong about the nature of intelligence itself. I would like to learn from you if you are willing to teach me. Jake looked up from his weapon with that calm expression she had learned to respect. You don't need to apologize for asking questions. That's what we're all here for. Besides, I think we could learn from each other. Your strategic analysis helped us understand why our tactics worked even when we couldn't explain it ourselves. The human team welcomed her into their training sessions with the same casual acceptance they showed for everything else. Lisa taught her how to recognize structural weaknesses that could be exploited during combat. Katie showed her how to read terrain and predict enemy movement patterns through subtle environmental cues. Ben explained how to maintain calm under pressure and make decisions when perfect information wasn't available. In return, Zixthera shared her theoretical knowledge and analytical abilities. She helped them understand the mathematical principles behind their intuitive tactics and showed them how to predict enemy responses based on established behavioral patterns. The collaboration produced insights that neither humans nor Velthari could have achieved independently. Her final academy project became a groundbreaking study on cross-species tactical integration. Instead of documenting human limitations, she analyzed how different forms of intelligence could be combined to create more effective military units. The research drew attention from defense analysts throughout the galaxy. Graduation day arrived 6 months later, with ceremonies that celebrated the Academy's survival of the Corvaxi attack. Zixthera stood with the human team as they received joint commendations for developing innovative defensive tactics during the crisis. The award citation specifically mentioned their success in combining analytical planning with adaptive execution. As they prepared for their first deployment together as a mixed-species tactical unit, Zixthera reflected on how completely her understanding of intelligence and capability had changed. She no longer saw humans as primitive creatures stumbling through complex situations. Instead, she recognized them as partners whose unique abilities made the entire team more effective. The transport shuttle that would carry them to their new assignment was the same type that had brought her to Station Apex 7 months earlier. But as Zixthera boarded alongside Jake, Lisa, Katie, Ben, and Danny, she was a completely different person than the arrogant young cadet who had arrived convinced of her own intellectual superiority. She had learned that evolution produces many different kinds of perfection, and that true wisdom comes from recognizing the value in forms of intelligence that operate differently from our own. The galaxy was vast and dangerous, filled with threats that required every possible advantage to overcome. She was grateful to face those challenges alongside humans who could see patterns where others saw only chaos, and find solutions where others found only problems. As the shuttle departed Station Apex 7 and set course for their first mission together, Zixthara looked forward to discovering what new insights their partnership might reveal. The universe was full of mysteries that would require both careful analysis and intuitive adaptation to solve. She could think of no better companions for such discoveries than the humans who had taught her that intelligence comes in many forms, and that wisdom lies in learning to recognize and respect them all.